Hi there, this is a follow-up video that I split off from my main review of House of the Dragon's Season 2 premiere episode, A Son for a Son. That in that I said I have a lot more to say about Cregan Stark and the North, but to keep this from running long and to give it its own focus, I'm splitting it off to a separate video, so here we are. And the general reaction I've seen to the first episode is nothing but praise for most of it, varying from person to person of what scenes they liked best in the middle of it, except for the very beginning and the very end. Now, the very end, blood and cheese, I'm talking about that in separate videos, please don't talk about that here. That was dividing the discussion of people for or against it. But it's been pretty uniform, in contrast, that everyone was kind of disappointed with how little we saw the North in this. At the beginning, we had one long, 5 full minutes is actually pretty long for a TV show, but a 5-minute prologue scene in the North, and that's it. When, if you haven't read the book, the point is, everyone thought we could get a multi-episode story arc out of this. I mean, it wouldn't be an A-plot, but we don't even see him visiting the Vale, and he could have spent considerable time in the North doing a couple of things. Not the whole season, but like through episode 3 or 4. And I can understand structurally why they wanted him back reacting with Rhaenyra for all the things that are going to happen now. And it just didn't sync up right, but, well, my view on this and everyone else's generally is, for what it was, this brief prologue, it was decent. Don't get us wrong, it's not like they made giant mistakes in it. It's just, this was supposed to be a story arc. What's going on here? And when they even said in the promo stuff, they didn't hype it too much, but they did say, oh, we're going to see Winterfell, and they got the fans hyped up on that, or maybe we hyped ourselves. Winterfell, specifically, isn't really in this. We saw it in a montage, and speaking characters aren't in it. Then again, Ryan Condal openly refers to this prologue as fan service in the behind-the-scenes videos. Using that word, he says this is all just fan service. Okay, that they wanted just a nice fan service thing in there, that they're mostly focused on the Targaryens, I get that. I still think they could have tied all this in, and it's a missed opportunity for that longer subplot. I didn't hate it, it's just, let's pick this apart and what we saw in it. Point by point, I'm going to go through this. First, Tom Taylor was good as Cregan Stark, maybe not great. I didn't really fall in love with it instantly. But what can we reasonably expect an actor to do with a single 5-minute scene? I really want you to talk about this in the comments. That did you like or Tom Taylor? Can we reasonably dislike him as a performance when he got such little material? So that's a problem for the writers, not for Tom. I thought he did a decent job. It's just, what is there for him to work with in this? It's weird. I wonder what the reaction is of reviewers, dedicated reviewers who are watching this blind without reading the book. What do they think of Cregan? Because the Fire and Blood version of him, Cregan Stark isn't just a copy of Ned Stark or Jon Snow as this stereotypical Stark Northerner. I mean, there's some similarities broadly because he is a Stark, but he has his own specific backstory that sets him apart from them, which they didn't mention here at all. So that's the weird thing. They complain about, well, Fire and Blood is just an outline. A lot of these characters we have to invent details about. Cregan had a decent amount setting him apart as a character. They can't claim we didn't have a lot to work with when you're cutting things out. That, just rattling this off quickly, that his father died when he was still underage, so his uncle became regent, but tried to usurp him. Then he had to wrestle back rule from him, all when he was a teenager. So he's had an eventful life, even though he's in his early 20s at this point. Or, I don't know, how he married his childhood sweetheart, but she died in childbirth a year ago, so he's this widower at like 22 with an infant son. These are major character things that would affect this guy. None of this comes up in conversation, because there's only one seed. And don't get me wrong, there is no way to bring any of this up in one 5-minute scene. What we're asking is there should have been a story arc rounding this guy out. And the North in general, that make use of the setting that House of the Dragon is a prequel story to say something distinct about the Starks in this prequel era. I mean, they actually managed to do that with the Lannister twins. I mean, not a lot, but enough that they had characterization and actual prequel story building. That you can see that Jason and Tyland aren't just like a carbon copy of Tyrion and a carbon copy of Jaime. That they have Lannister traits that tend to get repeated over the generations, that reverberate through history, but like putting them through a blender, that they're mixed and matched, that Jason has like elements of the cocky side of Jaime and Cersei, whereas Tyland is like this mix of Tyrion and Kevin. That you see that they played around with it, that the whole thing that history doesn't repeat, it rhymes. But in a family and logically like that. And we even see a bit of what the Lannisters are like as well. This is a prequel setting. You see they are not political insiders. They are not favorites at the royal court. That Jason is really pushing for a royal marriage alliance because at this time period the families closest to the crown are the Velaryons and to a lesser extent the Hightowers, that they're trying to get their foot in the door. So it wasn't much, but it was something to set these guys apart. And I'm not even asking for like an A plot across a season scale. We didn't even... Tyland and the Lannisters got more development than Cregan did, if this is indeed the only amount he's going to appear this season. And he will appear in later seasons too, so I'm not too angry about this, but it just seemed weird that you would have him visit so briefly. And there were other things. This is all just characterization for specifically Cregan I'm complaining about. Other things from these prequel Starks, making use of a prequel setting in this generation, which could have still tied in with the Targaryens if they go the spine of the story as the Targaryens. Okay, I thought you were going to bring up that the Starks are one of the few great houses, one of the few houses in general who actually voted for Rhaenys at the Great Council. Well, in the book it was for Laenor, but Rhaenys' bloodline, that the only two great houses who voted for her were the Baratheons because her mother was a Baratheon, and the Starks. And why would the apolitical Starks vote for the not favored candidate? Well, there was this whole thing where Jaehaerys was seizing lands to donate to the Night's Watch. They were angry about that, and in turn that would bring up, what, Jaehaerys thought there was some threat coming from beyond the wall? Actually, he did. So we thought this would have tied in with all of that. This isn't just like, oh, we wanted more expositions for the Ironborn or the Tyrells. Like, this is stuff that ties in with Rhaenys and the Great Council and Jaehaerys and stuff. And it is puzzling that you would leave it out. The new gift land seizure by Jaehaerys, how they voted at the Great Council that Cregan is a widower already. They had to fight his uncle, and he kind of sympathizes with Rhaenyra being usurped. Also that he had a younger brother who recently died as well, so he sympathizes with Jace that his younger brother just got killed and all of that. And you'll notice that, I hope reasonably, everything I've been saying up to now, I'm not even touching on the choice of whether or not to include that Cregan was rumored to have a bastard half-sister named Sarah Snow. There are only two named Starks in this prequel era. They're not a giant family. They just had an internal struggle, so there's only really two left. Cregan and Sarah. And yes, she's only in Mushroom's version of the history, and there's this whole thing I've talked about in other videos, that Gildain says, I'll allow that maybe she existed because they tended not to record bastard children in the annals and stuff. But the idea that she fell in love with Jace and he married her is foolishness. And I thought the truth was somewhere in between, that I thought we'd see Sarah Snow and that she has eyes for him, much as Éowyn was attracted to Aragorn, but that nothing comes of it. I am willing to accept as, reasonable needs of adaptation, that this is above and beyond. And it affects Jace's characterization. And it might not be going anywhere, that a reasonable person could say, well, we kind of need to cut Sarah Snow for time, even though the fans are really intrigued by her, just from a structural standpoint, that it'll be introducing a whole other set of things, it's not tied to other stuff. Even in the source material, people doubt she existed. I get all of that. I'm saying not even touching whether you decide to put Sarah Snow in or not, that as a reasonable adaptation decision, if you cut her, I expected them to be talking about things the prequel Starks did that specifically tie into the Targaryens, that they were angry at Jaehaerys about the new gift land seizure, which was really about the White Walkers, so they voted for Rhaenys to the Great Council. To tie it all in, that if their argument is, well, it needs to tie in with the Targaryens, that does. So I feel bad for Tom Taylor, who's actually a pretty good actor on all of this, and when people go, oh, he's talking like he's imitating Ned Stark and Jon Snow, well, yeah, because they have a northern accent. They all have the same regional accent, and I thought he did a decent job with that. It's just for the amount of dialogue he had in one scene that he's trying to play this reasonable but stern guy. What did he actually have to work with that we can judge him as an actor? Judge the writing, but not him, so please tell me about that in the comments. Moving on from that, though, that the fundamental thing is just this should have been a multi-episode story arc. Not a lot, but it should have been more than one scene. Or literally 2 more 5-minute scenes in the first episode, bringing it up to 70 minutes, I know. Just of them yakking about, yes, but we voted for Rhaenys. Oh, my uncle usurped me. That would have been like 3 lines of dialogue, and it would have added so much to the character. What did work, however, moving on to the final points here, that I wasn't totally upset with all this. Some things actually did work within the limits of 5 minutes of screen time. That there were 2 things that worked for me that did manage to convey that. Well, first off, yes, as others have pointed out, the dialogue seemed a little wooden, because it's exposition heavy. And, I've seen this in other shows, that the opening scene of any new season tends to get rewritten so many times, because it's so important, has so much exposition in it, that it ends off coming a bit artificial. But then in the rest of the episode, Jace, Colette gave this wonderful performance in all of his other scenes, so I think that's more of a writing thing of that they were juggling exposition with that. On rewatch, it was better. That I actually kind of liked what they were doing with it. It wasn't standout acting, it wasn't terrible. No one line stuck out from the dialogue as clunky. These are 2 political lords speaking formally who have never met before. Comes off as, well, it wouldn't be the repartee that we see between Daemon and Rhaenyra or something. I get that now. But 2 things they got right. The first is they quickly and succinctly managed to convey the exposition to a TV-only audience of, look, the Starks, their attention is divided between North and South. They want to keep most of their men in the North, but he feels honor-bound by his oaths, so he says, look, I can at least send you a couple thousand elderly veterans, graybeards, and that he says, oh, well, can they fight? And he explains, no, they're hardened veterans who are unafraid to die. Like 50-ish, older men, like I'm thinking of Jorah Mormont, the old bear from early Game of Thrones. He's older, but he can fight, and he's really experienced. And consider, there hasn't been a major war in Westeros in 80 years. So these guys have experience fighting off wildling raiders. They're some of the... And the idea is the Black's army is smaller but more battle-hardened. That the Velaryons have been fighting pirates in the Stepstones. The Vale, they've been fighting the mountain clans all the time. The North has been fighting wildlings. That maybe not a full-scale war, but they've had a little more combat experience than they're going to stress with Gwaine Hightower. They said that the Hightowers have a lot bigger of an army and more money, but they're totally unblooded. So he's sending this group of, later seeing Jace tells Rhaenyra, he says he can send 2,000 men, older, hardened veterans. In the behind-the-scenes video, and I try to watch those before I make videos instead of the immediate reaction stuff, there was an image of the costuming room, and on a rack it said, Stark's Winter Wolves, which is good. So, behind-the-scenes label established that this hardened group of 2,000 men sent in as an advanced force of elite soldiers, they will be called the Winter Wolves in the TV show. So rewatching it, thinking, is this clunky, or is it just they kept rewriting it? There isn't any problem with this dialogue. It's setting up clearly, and the thing, you have to talk slowly and clearly for the people that don't know what we're talking about, explaining, we are sending a small advanced force because it's what I can spare. But, I'm stuck here. So they did manage to set up the Winter Wolves pretty clearly. But the second thing is the thing I actually liked and grinned at. However briefly, they did address, like, the whole thing of use this as a prequel era, say something with it as a prequel era, not just, oh look, it's Winterfell again, but what's different about it? Like, oh, it's King's Landing again, show, this is the Dragon Pit before it was ruined, or things like that. They briefly addressed what the Night's Watch is like in this time period, and I mean very briefly, but they weren't in Fire and Blood at all at this point, so I know it's just a cameo, but for what they had, this pretty much is the summary of the whole prologue. For a short 5-minute scene with only so much dialogue, they did what they could. That, when I was, fan theorizing here in the months leading up to the season premiere, when we knew the Night's Watch would return, we were making videos about, I check them, I'll link them below. This is the state of the Night's Watch at this point in time, what might we see? I thought we'd have multi-episode arcs, so I thought we'd, well, in my head it was something like, have a report come in to the Lord Commander saying, the garrison commander at Queensgate reports new wildling raids because winter's coming, and they're getting desperate now that summer's over. Like an Easter egg to show that a few more castles on the wall are actively manned. Like Queensgate has fallen into ruin by Game of Thrones time, just to show there's more than the bare minimum 3 castles they'd fallen back to by Jon Snow's time. Like, just name drop one of the garrison at one of the other castles. They couldn't do that, but what they could at least do was subtle nonverbal hints, just through costume design and set design, that they haven't declined quite as badly yet, that their clothes are more uniform and better quality. I mean, if you look in Game of Thrones Season 1, the poorer recruits from the dungeons are just wearing rags that they've dyed black. That their costuming is a little better, that particularly the set, that when you go back to Season 1, I was watching a clip of when Jon is talking to Uncle Benjen on top of the wall, and it's just, there's fallen over wooden pillars and torn cloth everywhere. It looks dilapidated. And the wood looks warped and old and castle black, versus for what we see of the one trench that Cregan and Jace are walking through looks well maintained. The one thing they did directly state in words in the behind-the-scenes video is the set builder, he explained, we altered the design of the wall, that it's in better repair, and if you notice, the color is different. It's notably whiter than it was in Game of Thrones. It was sort of grayish. They said it's bright and white to make it look newer. And that's the word he used. It looks newer, so it's whiter. And yeah, that actually tracks with the books, that they do repair the wall by laying down new layers of ice and gravel, because it melts a little in the summer, it weeps. That's what the Order of the Builders exists to do, that they lay down new layers of ice and stuff. So their numbers have declined so much by Game of Thrones times that they're barely doing that at all anymore. They said we can barely maintain what we have, much less, be actively repairing the wall all the time. This is basically what it looks like with a new coat of paint, when there's still enough builders to be laying down new ice and stuff. So, just in the design, they tried to show that. But that wasn't what I'm talking about. The one thing I really like that they did is, particularly because when we started hearing rumors about it, I thought it was a really stupid idea, then I got surprised. That when we first heard from the advanced screenings of Episode 1 that came out a full week ago, they let slip that, there's this thing where you see the Night's Watch drawing lots with stones and sending every 10th man, and I thought that sounded really stupid because I didn't have the full context. But now, with the full context of what Cregan said in the episode, I actually thought it was a really clever, invented detail by the TV writers. Cregan says, it's a tradition, but when I watched it a second time, he said, for thousands of years we sent condemned men, but then Torrhen Stark, the last Stark King, began a new tradition. The Starks have a lot of traditions, depends on how far back you want to go, that it's for the last 130 years since the conquest. It's a relatively new tradition, but he's explaining Torrhen Stark, who is the last king who infamously knelt to Aegon the Conqueror and submitted to him, that it directly answers a question specific to this prequel era. That's what I've been talking about this whole time. say something about this as a prequel era distinct from other eras. How would the Starks try to keep the Watch's numbers up in peacetime? Think about it, that for thousands of years, the Watch would get a steady trickle of recruits from the losing sides in the constant wars between the Seven Kingdoms. But when Aegon the Conqueror unified Westeros, that dried up right away, led to their rapid decline over the next 300 years. And I can see how the TV writers treated this as a thought experiment, one step at a time, that, oh, well, if the recruits all dried up like that, instantly, within a generation, while Torrhen Stark was still alive, were the Starks blind to this manpower shortage? Well, probably not. Did they try to address it somehow? Yeah, I guess. Well, how would they address it? That they came up with, within living memory of the conquest, Torrhen Stark himself came up with, oh, the numbers are dropping because there's no losing sides of wars anymore. I'm going to need to institute a tradition where we draw lots and send every 10th able-bodied man. So reflecting on it, that was actually a really good piece of world building for this prequel era, and it raises other questions of, well, Cregan seems to believe in the White Walkers, and the Starks believe enough in the threat that they're actively sending every 10th man, and by Ned Stark's time, they're not really as big into believing in the White Walkers, and they're only sending condemned men to the wall. They've stopped this tradition of drawing lots. When did that tradition stop? When did they stop believing in all of this? After Cregan's time, between then and Dunk and Egg, there were a lot of Stark lords who died in rapid succession, leading to a point where the North was in chaos, and there were like 4 or 5 different Stark widows vying for power in Winterfell. They called them the She-Wolves of Winterfell, and it was going to be a big crisis until this wandering hedge knight and his bald squire, sass-mouth kid, came in, and it was a whole thing. So I can see how the disruption leading up to the She-Wolves of Winterfell era might have been why they stopped doing this. Or maybe there have been plagues since then, the Great Spring Sickness. Even a few decades after this, the winter fever guts the North and devastates the Night's Watch, they said. So this is what we should be using a prequel era for, to explain, well, logically, we tried some new policy to keep the numbers up, send every 12th person by lot, raises the question of why they stopped doing it. That is kind of what salvaged all of this for me, that, okay, it's decent exposition of it did what it needed to do, set up the Winter Wolves. And it was this neat little piece of world building about Torrhen Stark realized they had a manpower shortage. Everything else, though, that Cregan is an interesting character and he kind of felt shorted. Oh, one brief thing before I leave. They did make 2 lore mistakes about prior Targaryens at the Wall. Well, I don't even consider the first one a mistake, that he says, oh, Torrhen Stark treated with Aegon the Conqueror here at the Wall. I don't think in context he meant this was during the Targaryen conquest. He knelt in the Riverlands, and they know that. I think he's just logically referring to some later meeting, that he didn't say treated with him to negotiate his surrender. He was having some other meeting with him maybe decades later, 20 years later, who knows. Maybe Aegon the Conqueror visited the Wall at a later point, and book fans do point out that Martin has confirmed Aegon the Conqueror in the Song of Ice and Fire that he dreamed the White Walkers were returning. That is book canon. Then why does Fire and Blood so rarely mention Aegon making royal progresses to Winterfell or the Wall? You'd think someone having dreams about the apocalypse coming from the snowy north would visit the edge of the world at the Wall. And I'll go with unreliable narrator of Fire and Blood. Maybe he did visit and just didn't have it recorded. I mean, he has access to a dragon. He could have flown there. But I'm not giving the TV writers beef about that. If anything, Aegon should have been visiting the Wall relatively soon after the conquest and meeting with Torrhen there. So I would have put that in. It matches up with the whole prophecy dream more, so I'm not even going to hold that against the TV writers. It was a subsequent meeting, that's fine. No, the only real lore mistake that really stood out is he says, and this was another letdown, King Jaehaerys and his queen Alysanne visited the wall with their dragons at this very spot in the time of my father, and their dragons refused to cross over it because of the evil on the other side. When we were thinking of this season, we thought, okay, saying that isn't as impactful as actually showing Vermax at the wall, afraid to cross over it. And it was weird that they didn't do that. Or just show him in the courtyard looking wary and not wanting to go near the wall, not even flying. They could have done that. And 70 years ago was when Alysanne visited the wall alone without Jaehaerys. So it couldn't have been in the time of Cregan's great-grandfather. I don't think they're referring to when Alysanne visited the wall. I was going to yell more about this, but I'm thinking maybe they're, like the Aegon the Conqueror thing, maybe they're just referring to some subsequent, they're inventing a subsequent trip to the wall that both Alysanne and Jaehaerys did. And that it was during that, at least you see in the first episode when Rhaenyra is invested as the heir, his father is an elderly man at that point. So could Rickon have been alive when Jaehaerys was still alive? Yeah, like in the 80s or 90s after Conquest. I mean, he was an older man at that point, but he just says, my father was here, not that my father was ruling. Even then, I know the dates are fuzzy and everything, and I'm not really going to get into the weeds too much on this. I know it's mental gymnastics. Whole point is, maybe they're inventing a second visit because, I'll leave it at this, we have heard rumors there will be flashbacks this season actually showing Jaehaerys going to the wall and shutting down the Night Fort. And I can't confirm that. But part of me wonders, are they setting up that invented flashback for later this very season? So I'm going to table the issue for now is this, I know it'd be the honeypotting, it's just, we only have 7 more episodes. We'll see soon enough. Are they going somewhere with this? Because that doesn't seem quite like what the book described, and it was actually a later trip or something. So that might be going somewhere. And we have heard other rumors that, like, maybe Cregan will come with the Winter Wolves. We're not really sure. They might be doing a couple things. I try to stick to what I can prove, but if this was all we got of the North this season, it was quite a letdown. But some things could be happening later.